My name is Natalie Whitmore, and from the outside, my life appeared deliberate. The penthouse overlooked the marina, all glass and clean lines, the kind of residence that communicated stability without announcing it. I had built a career as a corporate financial consultant specializing in asset protection and estate structuring, the quiet mechanics of wealth that most people never see and fewer still understand. I moved through boardrooms and private offices with the ease of someone who had learned early that knowledge, applied at the right moment, is the most durable form of power. When my father, Richard Whitmore, passed away after a brief illness 18 months ago, my older brother Grant Whitmore and I inherited equal shares of Whitmore Development Group, 50% each. Balanced. Intentional. My father had been precise about this. He believed in equity, in symmetry, in the idea that his two children should carry his legacy forward as partners rather than competitors. Grant took over daily operations. He was the face of the company, the one who shook hands at groundbreakings and gave speeches at industry dinners. I remained strategic, a silent partner with full voting authority and access to financial records. It was an arrangement that suited us both, or so I believed. I thought we were honoring our father's vision together. I thought wrong. The first inconsistency was almost forgettable. A quarterly dividend distribution arrived in my account lower than projected, not dramatically so, but enough that I paused over my morning coffee and ran the numbers twice. I called Grant the same afternoon. He answered on the second ring, voice easy, unhurried, the way it always was when he wanted you to feel like nothing was worth worrying about. He blamed market corrections, delayed project closings. One commercial property in the Eastern District had pushed its timeline by 6 weeks. These things happen, he said, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. Later that evening, reviewing internal financial summaries he'd forwarded, I noticed a consulting firm listed among the quarterly expenses. The fees were substantial, not alarming in isolation, but notable. The company name meant nothing to me. I searched my memory for any board discussion that might have introduced a new strategic partner. Nothing surfaced. When I asked Grant at our next family dinner, he waved his fork dismissively. Strategic growth advisors. Short-term cost, long-term. Again. They are helping us reposition the Eastern portfolio. He didn't elaborate. He offered no documentation, no introduction, no meeting request. He didn't need to, he assumed. But something inside me began to watch. I told myself I was being overly analytical. Grief does strange things to trust. It erodes foundations you never thought to examine, makes familiar faces appear strange, turns reassurance into something that rings hollow no matter how reasonably it's delivered. Our father, Richard, had been gone less than a year. Of course there would be adjustments. Of course the company would shift under new sole operational leadership. Grant had always been ambitious, sometimes abrasively so. He pushed timelines, pressured contractors, made deals at speeds that occasionally left board members breathless. But ambition and dishonesty are not the same thing. I reminded myself of this during the long evenings I spent at my kitchen counter, city lights shimmering below while I scrolled through spreadsheets I had already reviewed once. The discrepancies weren't dramatic. There was no single missing million, no gaping hole in a balance sheet. There were margins that didn't quite align with raw revenue figures, expense categories that held steady, while underlying projects scaled down. Numbers that, viewed individually, could be explained. Numbers that, viewed together, formed a quiet but coherent pattern. And patterns, in my profession, are never accidental. I didn't act on my suspicion. Not yet. I simply began paying closer attention, accessing archived records through my ownership credentials. Rather than relying on the summaries Grant's team prepared, I told myself it was professional diligence. Privately, I knew it was something more. I found it on a Tuesday evening in February, 3 weeks after that first dinner conversation. I had accessed the company's financial archive through my co-owner credentials, pulling raw ledger entries rather than the curated summaries forwarded to my inbox each quarter. The consulting firm appeared again, larger fees this time, spread across 3 separate billing cycles to avoid clustering. I noted the registration date on the vendor file, 3 months prior to first payment. That struck me as unusual. A consulting engagement of that size would typically involve due diligence, references, and a formal proposal. The registration appeared abrupt, as though the vendor had been inserted, rather than onboard. I traced the billing address. It led to a holding company registered in Delaware. That holding company connected to a private LLC formed 11 months earlier. The LLC belonged to Grant. I sat with that for a long moment, the city outside indifferent and bright. The logic assembled itself slowly, the way evidence always does. When you've trained yourself not to rush to conclusions. Funds weren't being channeled toward genuine advisors. They were being redirected internally, from our shared company, through a fabricated vendor, into an entity Grant owned outright. Systematically, quietly, over multiple quarters. The room didn't spin. My hands didn't shake. I simply closed the laptop, set down my pen, and understood that what I had feared had a name now. I didn't cry. I didn't call him. I sat at my kitchen counter while the city lights shimmered below and felt something shift inside me, not break, but rue-line. The way the compass needle swings when it finds north. There was a cold clarity to it. Surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. I had spent my career helping clients navigate exactly this kind of discovery, the moment when what you suspected becomes what you know. This wasn't impulsive theft. I needed to be clear about that with myself, because the distinction mattered both legally and personally. Grant hadn't reached into the till. He had constructed a structure. Shell entities, fabricated vendor relationships, internal memos that justified payments on paper. He had reduced profits on paper to reduce my distributions. He had built a quiet engine designed to enrich him, while appearing, to any casual review, like ordinary business expenses. This was architecture. It required planning, patience, and a fundamental belief that I would never look closely enough to find it. That last part was the part that settled the coldest. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had made a calculation about who I was. And he was wrong. I spent that night not in anger but in a kind of focused stillness. I thought about my father, who had trusted us both equally. I thought about what deliberate meant, what it cost, what it required. By morning, I had made my decision. The next morning, I called Grant. He answered casually, cheerful, in fact, the way he always was after a long stretch of silence between us, as though absence refreshed his confidence. I didn't give him anything to read in my voice. I congratulated him on expanding the advisory network. I mentioned that I'd noticed the new consulting fees and thought it showed real initiative to be investing in strategic support at this stage of the company's growth. There was a brief pause before he responded. Brief, but I caught it. Exactly, he said warmly. These relationships pay off long term. I'll put together a summary for you. He never did. But the relief in his voice, subtle, controlled, but audible to someone listening for it, told me everything I needed to know about where his concern had been sitting. Silence is unsettling when someone expects anger. It destabilizes in a way that confrontation never does, because confrontation invites defense, and defense is something people rehearse. Calm acceptance, on the other hand, leaves no script to follow. Grant would spend the next several days wondering whether I had truly looked closely or whether I had simply found an explanation that satisfied me. That uncertainty would become my advantage. I let him wonder. I went back to my records. I built the case the way I built every financial model, methodically, without emotion, with a discipline that had taken years to develop. I downloaded everything accessible through my ownership credentials. Transfer histories, vendor registration documents, tax filings, internal memos, metadata timestamps on file modifications. I cross-referenced payment dates against project timelines, looking for moments where the consulting fees appeared in quarters when no new strategic initiative had been announced or discussed at board level. There were many such moments. The transfers had been structured carefully, always under the thresholds that would trigger automatic reporting flags, always accompanied by internal justification memos. Documents I now recognized had been authored by Grant or members of his direct team, never by an independent Party. The paper trail was designed to be discoverable only by someone who already knew what they were looking for and had the patience to trace it backward through multiple corporate layers. I organized my findings into folders I kept on an encrypted drive, not on the company server. Chronological. Cross-referenced. Labeled with neutral descriptors rather than accusations. I was building documentation, not a narrative. Narratives can be disputed. Documentation, properly assembled, simply sits and waits to be read. Each evening after my workday ended, I added another layer. Another. Quarter mapped. Another entity connection noted. Another transfer amount. Confirmed against source records. My brother was meticulous. I was more so. And I was only beginning. 3 weeks into my quiet investigation, I found something that changed the nature of what I was dealing with. I was reviewing a shared governance folder that both Grant and I had access to, a repository of corporate documents, charter amendments, and regulatory filings. Buried within a subfolder labeled Draft, Internal Review, I found an operating agreement revision. It had not been submitted to the board. It had not been shared with me formally. It was dated 6 weeks prior. I read it 3 times. The amendment proposed reducing my voting influence through performance-based clauses, specifically, a provision that tied voting weight to a partner's active operational contribution, as defined by revenue metrics. Revenue metrics that, I now understood, were being deliberately suppressed through the same transfer scheme I had already documented. Under Grant's version of events, the company was underperforming. Under the true figures, it was not. The amendment was engineered to use manufactured underperformance as a mechanism to strip me of governance power. He wasn't just redirecting money. He was engineering a takeover. The financial theft was a means to an end, a way to create conditions that would allow him to legally diminish my position, formalize his control, and eventually operate the company as though my 50% shares were merely decorative. This had never been temporary opportunism. This was a long game. And it had begun before our father was even gone. I contacted Victoria Hale on a Wednesday morning, scheduling the meeting. Under the pretense of a routine legal consultation, Victoria's practice focused on corporate litigation and fiduciary law. I had worked alongside her on 2 estate restructuring matters during the previous year, professional encounters, efficient and respectful. She was the kind of attorney who listened more than she spoke, which in my experience was the truest mark of a sharp legal mind. Her office occupied the 14th floor of a building that overlooked the courthouse plaza, appropriate, I thought, in a way I appreciated. Without sentimentality, I arrived 5 minutes early and declined the offered coffee. I didn't dramatize. I simply placed printed documents on her desk. Transfer records, vendor registration traces, the LLC ownership chain, the draft amendment, and let her read in silence. She reviewed each page carefully, moving with the deliberate pace of someone building comprehension rather than confirming a prior assumption. After perhaps 12 minutes, she set the last document down and looked at me directly. "This is a breach of fiduciary duty," she said quietly. "And it's substantial." It was the first time my private conclusions had been spoken aloud by another person. There was no relief in it, exactly, more a kind of grounding. What I had assembled in solitude now had legal weight. Victoria's tone remained professional, measured. She reached for a legal pad. "Walk me through the timeline," she said. I did. Victoria outlined the legal landscape with the precision I had come to expect from her. Self-dealing, undisclosed conflicts of interest, misrepresentation of company profits to a co-owner, breach of fiduciary duty by an officer to the partnership. Potentially, depending on the scale of what the forensic process would reveal elements of constructive fraud. Each term carried specific meaning and specific remedies. Victoria explained them, without inflating their severity and without minimizing it. Grant had clearly believed that his social fluency would protect him, that if anything were ever questioned, he could explain, contextualize. Charm. He had underestimated the degree to which documentation operates entirely outside the realm of personality. A bank transfer doesn't respond to a smile. A registration timestamp doesn't soften under the warmth of a good story. The same qualities that made Grant effective at building relationships were entirely irrelevant in the face of what I had assembled. Victoria recommended we pursue an independent forensic audit, which I had the right to initiate as a co-owner. She also flagged the possibility of a civil claim and, depending on forensic findings, potential regulatory referral. We discussed timing carefully. Too early, and Grant would have an opportunity to obscure or restructure. Too late, and additional funds could be diverted. The window was precise. We would need to create conditions of continued normalcy while preparing to move with complete decisiveness. I left her office with a legal strategy and a clearer sense of what winning actually looked like. In the weeks that followed, Victoria and her team worked backward through the financial records I had provided, corroborating what I had found independently and built a legal-grade chronology. The transfers, we confirmed, had begun before our father died. Not in the weeks immediately following the estate settlement. Not in the first confused months of grief when oversight might naturally loosen. They had begun 6 months before Richard Whitmore passed away, during his illness, while the family gathered around a man who was slowly disappearing, while Grant sat in strategy meetings and managed quarterly projections with every appearance of loyalty. He had anticipated the inheritance. He had built the infrastructure to exploit it before it was even legally his. When Victoria shared this finding with me across her conference table, I received it without visible reaction. I had prepared myself for the possibility, having traced one early period anomaly myself. But the confirmation, the cold, documented certainty that Grant had begun planning while our father was still alive, settled something in me permanently. This did not devastate me in the way grief had. Grief is loss made sharp by love. What I felt in that moment was something more clarifying, a removal of the last ambiguity. There was nothing left to wonder about. No alternative interpretation. No generous reading of the evidence. Grant had chosen this long ago. That knowledge didn't wound me. It simply made the next steps cleaner. Hurt faded somewhere in those weeks, and I let it go without ceremony. I had allowed myself a private period of grief, not for the money or the legal complexity, but for the version of my brother I had believed in. The one who had sat beside me at our father's hospital bedside and held his hand. The one who had delivered a eulogy so well constructed that I had wept despite myself, had believed, in that moment, that whatever frictions existed between us were the ordinary abrasions of two ambitious people sharing a complicated inheritance. That grief was real. I honored it briefly and set it aside. What replaced it was precision. I stopped asking why. Motive, in legal proceedings, is supporting context at best. It rarely changes outcomes. What mattered was structure, the architecture of what had been done, and consequence, the legal and financial correction that structure required. I stopped seeing Grant as my brother in this context. That framing was no longer useful. The relationship between us had been made transactional by his own decision-making, and I could either resist that reality emotionally or accept it practically. I chose acceptance. He was now a business adversary, one who had miscalculated. And adversaries, in my experience, are best handled not with confrontation but with strategy, patient, thorough, executed at the moment of your own choosing and no one else's. I returned to my plans with a quieter mind. While Victoria's team worked on legal preparation, I worked on my own. The demand letter Victoria had drafted was held deliberately, not yet sent, not yet triggered. We agreed that premature disclosure would prompt Grant to begin asset restructuring, potentially moving the waterfront property and other acquisitions he had made through shell entities into harder-to-reach positions. We needed the forensic audit in motion before he understood the full scope of what was coming. I also turned my attention to my own financial exposure. As a 50% owner in a company whose officer was engaged in ongoing self-dealing, my own assets carried indirect risk, not because I had done anything improper, but because legal proceedings of this nature can complicate liquidity and credit positions unexpectedly. I spent 2 weeks quietly restructuring my personal investments, diversifying away from company-adjacent holdings, ensuring my liquid reserves were sufficient to sustain a protracted legal process without pressure. Preparation brings calm. I believe this genuinely, not as a motivational principle but as a practical truth. When you have removed the conditions for panic, panic cannot take root. Every step I took to reduce my own vulnerability made the next step easier to execute without emotion distorting judgment. By the time Victoria's team was ready to move, my personal financial position was entirely separate from the outcome of the proceedings. I was protected. I was ready. And Grant, operating confidently in a silence he had mistaken for ignorance, had no idea. I began attending board meetings again. I had been intermittently present since my father's death, engaged when needed, absent when not. This was consistent with my role as a non-operational partner, so my increased attendance carried no obvious signal. I framed it to Grant as a renewed interest in the company's strategic direction, something he received exactly as I intended. As flattering. He appeared genuinely pleased. At the first meeting I attended after my decision was made, I asked measured questions, not accusations, clarifications. The kind of specific, detailed queries that an engaged shareholder asks as a matter of good governance. What was the performance to date on the Eastern portfolio? Who had approved the expanded advisory budget? What were the criteria for vendor selection in the consulting category? I watched the room while I asked. I watched Thomas Reed particularly, a long-tenured board member who had served under my father and remained on the board under Grant's tenure. Reed was a careful man, professionally cautious, loyal in the institutional sense. I had always considered him a Grant ally by proximity rather than conviction. Loyalty of that kind is conditional. It shifts when the weight of evidence changes what loyalty costs. I could see in Reed's expression, as Grant provided answers that didn't quite align with questions I had framed to expose that misalignment, the first faint shadow of discomfort. Numbers were beginning to speak. I intended to let them finish. Grant grew bolder as autumn turned toward winter. The transfer amounts increased, not dramatically, but meaningfully. The consulting fees expanded. A new market analysis vendor appeared in the expense ledger, traceable through the same LLC network as the first. He was scaling the operation, emboldened by what he read as my continued trust and the board's unquestioning deference. The waterfront property was acquired in November, a substantial commercial holding in the Harbor District, purchased through one of his private shell entities using funds I could trace, through the transfer records, to redirect company profits. It was the most significant single acquisition he had made, and it was done entirely outside the company structure, invisibly funded by our shared asset. At Thanksgiving dinner, our mother, Margaret Whitmore, sat at the head of the table she had presided over for 40 years and praised Grant's leadership. She spoke of the company as though it were thriving under his guidance. She spoke of the future with warmth. Grant accepted her words with the ease of someone who had never considered that the ground beneath him might be shifting. I smiled throughout dinner. I helped clear the dishes. I drove home and added the waterfront property acquisition to my documentation folder. Confidence built too early is fragile. The higher it rises before it is tested, the more completely it collapses when the test arrives. Grant had built his confidence very high. Privately, the forensic auditor, Ethan Caldwell, completed his independent review in late November. Ethan was a former regulatory examiner who now ran a boutique forensic accounting practice. Victoria had engaged him specifically because his methodology was court-ready, documented chain of custody, no reliance on materials that could be challenged as self-reported, cross-verification against third-party bank confirmations wherever obtainable. His work was slow by design, slow and airtight. I met with him once, briefly, at Victoria's office. He was methodical in person, unhurried, specific, the kind of person who doesn't offer opinions before he has earned the right to them through documentation. When he presented his preliminary findings, he did so without drama, walking through figures and connections with the neutrality of a man, describing weather patterns. The total amount redirected, across the period under review, was larger than I had initially estimated. I received this news in the same room where I had first met with Victoria, in the same straight-backed chair, with the same outward composure that I had maintained throughout this process. Ethan noted no reaction in me, which was correct. Publicly, I continued to support Grant. I attended his end-of-year leadership dinner. I offered a brief, warm toast. Timing matters more than emotion. We identified the quarter with the largest single discrepancy, one, where the gap between actual revenue and reported revenue was widest and most clearly documented. Then we prepared to move. The formal audit request was submitted to the board in the first week of December. Victoria filed it under my co-owner authority, citing standard governance provisions. The language was procedural, a routine exercise of oversight rights in response to financial irregularities identified through independent review. No accusations in the filing. No names named. Simply a request, supported by legal authority, for a comprehensive forensic audit of company accounts spanning the preceding 26 months. Procedural documents land differently than emotional ones. Grant called me within 40 minutes of the filing being received by the board. You could have spoken to me first, he said. His voice was controlled, but the speed of the call told its own story. I replied. This is that conversation. A pause. I don't understand what you think you found. You will, I said. The audit will explain it more clearly than I could. I kept the call short. There was nothing to be gained from length. He would spend the next days and weeks in the space between suspicion and confirmation, unable to predict exactly what the audit team would find, uncertain how much I already knew, unable to move against me without making his awareness of culpability visible. I had chosen the timing, the mechanism, and the framing. The audit began the following Monday, and the ground beneath Grant's confidence finally began to move. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that I recognized from complex litigation matters I had observed throughout my career, a mounting pressure that everyone in the room could feel but no one named aloud. Bank confirmations were requested from third-party institutions, bypassing the company's internal records entirely. This was standard forensic practice, but it meant that Grant's team had no ability to curate or contextualize what the auditors received. Third-party verifications of vendor relationships were initiated, requests sent to the holding companies behind the consulting firms asking for standard documentation of services rendered, deliverables produced, and personnel involved in engagements. No substantive responses came back. Shells, when interrogated directly, echo. I watched Grant at the one board meeting that occurred during the audit. Period. He sat in his usual position at the head of the table and answered questions with his customary fluency, but something had changed. In the tempo of him. The pauses before answers were fractionally longer. The eye contact he maintained was slightly more deliberate, slightly more effortful. Sleep had left his voice, a flatness where there used to be easy. He was managing rather than performing. And management is visible to those who know what performance looks like. I took my notes. I asked my measured questions. I thanked him for his updates with genuine pleasantness. The confidence he had worn for months was cracking in ways only I could see. For now. We met in his office after the board's preliminary briefing on audit findings, a meeting I had requested, which he could not reasonably refuse without the refusal itself becoming conspicuous. It was after business hours. The building was quiet. There was no shouting. I had not come to the theater. He tried the approach I had anticipated, the managed concession, the minimizing frame. Look, there may have been some accounting approaches that weren't communicated well. Technical oversights in how certain advisory costs were categorized. Nothing that wasn't standard practice. I placed printed bank transfer records on the desk between us. He stopped speaking. This isn't an oversight, I said. My voice was level. It's architecture. You structured a vendor relationship through an entity you own, you created internal documentation to justify the expense, and you suppressed revenue reporting to reduce my distributions while the funds moved into your private accounts. That's not a categorization error. He looked at the documents for a long moment. You had this before the audit, he said. Yes. How long? Long enough to be thorough. For the first time in the months since I had discovered what he had done, I watched the last layer of his social armor come away. There was no charm left to offer, no warmth that would serve a purpose. He sat with the documents between us and had only justification, the last refuge of someone who has run out of alternatives. I waited. He didn't find any justification worth attempting. Ethan Caldwell presented his findings to the full board 10 days later. The presentation room was the same one where quarterly results were typically reviewed. Familiar furniture, familiar faces, the same light coming through the north-facing windows. Ethan presented in the same unhurried, neutral register that I had observed during our private meeting. He did not editorialize. He did not characterize intent. He presented data, source confirmations, and chains of documentation with the steady cadence of someone who trusted the material to speak without assistance. The room was very quiet. Grant sat at the table in his usual seat and was very still. Self-dealing. Breach of fiduciary duty. Undisclosed conflicts of interest. Misrepresentation of revenue to a co-owner of equal standing. Each finding was presented with its corresponding documentation. Transfer records, vendor registration traces, third-party confirmation. Gaps, metadata comparisons between when files were created and when they purported to reflect. Numbers, laid out plainly in sequence, have a particular weight that testimony doesn't. Thomas Reed, seated 3 positions down from Grant, studied his printed copy of the findings without once looking up at the man he had treated as a patron for 8 years. Reputation doesn't collapse loudly. There's no single moment of rupture. It erodes incrementally, as each person in the room privately recalibrates their understanding of a person they thought they knew. I watched the room recalibrate. The difference in how people occupied the room after Ethan finished presenting was striking. Board members shifted posture, subtle readjustments that spoke of a changed internal relationship with where they were sitting, who they were sitting beside us. The physical language of reconsideration. Thomas Reed, who had been a reliable Grant ally for years, set his copy of the findings face down when Ethan concluded, which I read as the gesture of someone who has seen enough and does not need to see more. Grant's confidence, the easy, unearned confidence of someone who has successfully performed competence for so long that he had confused the performance with reality, had thinned to something barely visible. He made one attempt at the table to contextualize the findings. He spoke for perhaps 90 seconds about aggressive but legitimate financial structuring and communication gaps in the advisory engagement process. The room received this in silence. Not hostile silence. Something worse than hostile. Indifferent silence. The silence of people who have already formed their conclusion and have no interest in arguments that don't address the evidence directly. Charm fails when numbers contradict it. This is something I had known professionally for years. Watching it operate in a space this personal was different, not satisfying in any way I had anticipated, but clarifying. The last of my uncertainty about whether I had done the right thing simply dissolved. He looked at me differently then. Not as his sister. As the person who had ended him. The board acted within 48 hours. Grant was removed from operational control pending the outcome of legal proceedings, a vote that passed without dissent, Thomas Reed's hand among those raised. The decision was recorded in meeting minutes with the same procedural neutrality that had characterized every step of this process, which felt appropriate. This was not a morality play. It was a governance correction. Victoria filed the civil claim the following week. Asset recovery. Proceedings were initiated, with the waterfront property and the private holdings traceable to redirected company funds identified as primary recovery targets. Personal accounts connected to the transfer chain were frozen pending court review, a step that required demonstrating to the court's satisfaction the documented connection between those accounts and company funds, which Ethan's forensic record made straightforward. Nothing about the next several months was dramatic. There were lawyers, and filings, and scheduled hearings, and document exchanges. There were phone calls I took standing at my kitchen counter, while the city moved outside my windows. There were moments when the sheer logistical weight of what was unfolding felt exhausting in a way that anger never could. But there was no moment of doubt. The system Grant had built to exploit the company was the same system that generated the records used to expose him. He had depended on complexity to hide what he was doing, and complexity, documented properly, is simply evidence with more detail. Correction has arrived. It had simply taken the shape of a process. He came to my penthouse on a Thursday evening in March, 6 weeks after the board voted. I answered the door. He stood in the hallway looking, for the first time, in memory, exactly as old as he was, not the polished, slightly larger-than-life version of himself that he had always projected, but simply a man in his early 50s who had made a calculated decision and was now living inside its consequences. I let him in. He sat on the sofa. He didn't look at the view. There was no arrogance in how he carried himself. No attempt at reframing. He sat with the straightforward posture of someone who had used up all available performances and arrived at an unfamiliar stillness. "I didn't think you'd go this far," he said, eventually. I sat across from him. The city was quiet in the way cities are only after midnight. "I didn't," I replied. "You did." He looked at me for a long moment. I watched him turning something over. Not the legal situation, I thought, but something older and less defined. The calculation he had made about who I was. Whether I would look, whether I would act, whether I was the kind of person who allowed things to happen to her or the kind who documented them. He finally understood which kind I was. And he understood, too, that his original assumption, that I trusted, without verifying, was the mistake that had made everything else possible. Silence had never meant ignorance. It had simply meant patience. The civil settlement was reached 8 months after the forensic audit presentation. The terms restored my full financial share with interest, recovered the value of the assets Grant had acquired through redirected funds, and granted me controlling operational interest in Whitmore Development Group pending final resolution. The draft operating agreement amendment, the one designed to diminish my voting influence through fabricated performance criteria, was formally voided as part of the settlement record. Victoria called me when the final signatures were in place. Her voice was its usual measured register, but I heard something that was not quite warmth and not quite satisfaction in it, a professional acknowledgement, perhaps, of a matter handled as cleanly as such matters can be handled. I took a week after the settlement before returning to the company's strategic affairs. Then I spent 3 months conducting what I privately called a transparency review, opening the company's financial records to the board with full visibility, restructuring internal governance to make the kind of self-dealing Grant had conducted structurally impossible. Going forward, ironically, the company's valuation improved substantially when its actual financial performance, no longer suppressed by artificial expense inflation, became visible. I sold my interest 9 months later at that improved valuation. I chose the timing. I chose the buyer. I ensured that my father's company passed into hands that would honor its purpose without honoring its name. I stepped away, not merely wealthier. I stepped away knowing the difference between what I had inherited and what I had earned. Power, experienced that second time, felt entirely different. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive in a sudden disclosure or a careless confession. It signs paperwork in quiet offices. It drafts amendments on Tuesday afternoons. It creates vendor registrations and holds companies and submits internal memos with the bland efficiency of someone who has decided that the person they are defrauding will never be curious enough, or thorough enough, or patient enough to find the architecture. It assumes you won't read the fine print. It assumes that trust, once established, becomes permanent, that the affection of a family relationship functions as a kind of cognitive shield, protecting the betrayer from scrutiny because scrutiny feels disloyal to the person extending it. Grant didn't lose me when I submitted the audit request. He didn't lose me when the board voted. He lost me long before any of that, in the moment he decided, deliberately, that my trust was a resource to be exploited rather than a relationship to be honored. Every document he drafted, every transfer he arranged, every internal memo he authored to justify what he was taking. Each one was also a decision about who he believed I was. He believed I was someone who wouldn't look. I looked. That single fact, my willingness to apply to my own life the same precision I applied to my work, to honor my own interests with the same diligence I brought to my clients, made everything else possible. My father raised 2 children. One managed the company in his name. One understood what his name was actually worth. I was always the second one. I simply had to prove it.